Okay, so thanks to Laurel for setting me up and setting up the rest of us. I'm going to be talking about female speakers and what the kind of scrutiny that female speech has withstood recently, certainly in the past too, but I'll be talking about some more recent cases of it. But for those of you who read The Onion, this headline here may seem familiar to you. You might have seen it before. So if you're a consumer of pop culture and pop culture media, you might have noticed that there's a fair amount of hand-wringing about women's voices that tends to go on. And so you might find advice columns or interviews or think pieces, letters to the editor. I could go on and on about the different formats that you might see out there about the unacceptability of women's voices and how annoying they are and how grating they are. So here are some examples of the kinds of articles that have been written in the past. So let's start with Upspeak. Recently, Greg actually was telling me that Upspeak was one of the first things that he studied and that it might have originated in Australia, but it certainly has been criticized as a feature of American women's speak. And if you aren't familiar with Upspeak, here's what it sounds like.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for having me. You look so pretty. I do.
So that's Katie Couric and Zooey Deschanel. So Katie Couric is interviewing Zooey Deschanel and welcoming her, and the two of them together are just a party of Upspeak. Another type of speech that's kind of like Upspeak, it has Upspeak going on in it, but it has another layer added on top, which is sometimes referred to as sexy baby voice. And here's an article I found that wrung hands about how this is prevalent among middle school girls, but it's been criticized among all types of women as well. So here's what this sounds like.
I said I don't know where to get a smoothie around here at all. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no worries.
Sexy baby voice. I don't have a clip of this in particular, but here's an advice column asking about why young women have such annoying nasal voices. It doesn't say annoying in the headline, but it does in the text. And here's kind of the pièce de résistance, right? So anybody who was following a lot of the media during the election might have noticed not only that Hillary Clinton tended to be considered shrill, but also that there was a lot of flack about this, that this is unacceptable to be calling our most prominent female politician to be using words like shrill to describe her. This is actually a quote from the New York Times that's pulled from this article, but in this article, they discussed how her speech had been called things like loud, flat, and harassing, or decidedly grating pitch and punishing tone. Yeah. And I want to point out that this article, who is written by a man, Ben Shapiro, has the headline, "Yes, Hillary Clinton is shrill, and it's not sexist to say so." Right, as if he gets to decide that. So there actually has been a fair amount of linguistic research on this topic, and I'm just going to point out three different phenomena that people have looked at. So just looking at the phenomenon of pitch, one study, for example, showed that both men and women are more likely to choose fictional political candidates who have lower pitched voices. So if you have men and women and they have examples that have both high pitch and low pitch, both men and women tend to prefer both men and women who have lower pitch because higher pitch is associated with women, and that is undesirable. If we look at breathiness as a voice quality, another study showed that female voices, well, if they're breathy, they score high on a benevolence scale, which might not be considered such a negative thing, but low on a dominance scale. Okay, so here's a scale in which people might want to score rather high, but here's an example in which women don't. And another study of uptalk showed that actually a number of studies have shown that both men and women today tend to use uptalk at fairly similar rates, but women tend to evaluate it more positively than men do. Okay, so when women are rating what they think about uptalk and how it sounds, they tend to think it's okay, whereas men say, no, this is unacceptable. So there's one speech characteristic that seems to get more attention than any other, right? The dreaded vocal fry, or as linguists tend to say, creaky voice. I don't like to call it vocal fry because I really dislike that term, so I'm going to go on calling it creaky voice for the rest of this. So just to give you an example of what creaky voice sounds like, in case you aren't entirely sure, here's an example, two examples from the same speaker. Here's the speaker's what we call modal voice, which is the smooth or periodic vibrations of the vocal folds during speech. Oops.
So he decided to make the deliveries himself.
Okay, and here's that same speaker being creaky.
That is a scary path.
Okay. She says that is a scary path, in case that wasn't clear.
That is a scary path.
Okay, so just a tiny bit of the science here. This creaky voice is a motive vocal fold vibration that's characterized by irregular closing of the vocal folds, and the main auditory property that seems to be most noticeable to people is that it has a particularly low pitch. All right, so back to the hand wringing. Here's an article in The Guardian that says, young women give up the vocal fry and reclaim your strong female voice. Here's another study that speculated that vocal fry may hurt women's job prospects. And in this last case, this is a commentator for CBS Sunday Morning, and what she says is that girls should be encouraged to find their voice, but it shouldn't be so annoyingly creaky. And yet, a last thing that we sort of find in some of these critical articles or critical mass media recountings of this phenomenon is that vocal fry is, well, it's not only the latest linguistic fad, but that it also can damage the vocal folds. And we might ask ourselves, is it actually hurting our vocal folds? And to that, linguists say, yeah, not really, no, it's not likely. So why do we think this? Well, creaky voice is actually a linguistic element that lots of languages around the world use to distinguish between words. Right? So you could have a word that has the same makeup of vowels and consonants, and the only thing that distinguishes it is whether or not the vowel is produced with modal voice or creaky voice. So here's an example from White Hmong, which is a language spoken in Laos, and here's the modal example of the word that means stick. And here's the creaky version. Of course, it's very short, so it's not quite as noticeably creaky, but it has the same vocal fold characteristics. Okay, so other languages, just in case you were wondering, are languages like Zapotec, Mazatec, Chong, and Hausa, and so on. So here's what you might not know about the use of vocal fry in American English. In fact, it has a linguistic use. This is the main use of it, and study after study has shown that in American English, creaky voice is used to signal that you're coming to the end of a phrase or a sentence. So here are two examples of people using creaky voice in exactly that environment. So the black part of the writing indicates no creaky voice, and the blue is where you're going to hear the creak.
I don't really see what the problem is. I don't really see what the problem is.
Okay, here's another example.
He was excited about this visit. He was excited about this visit.
Okay, so do men use creaky voice? Well, yeah, I just played you an example of a case where men use creaky voice. And in fact, one recent study showed that 12% of men's college syllables, so they were doing a reading task, and 12% of the syllables in the reading passage that the men spoke contained creaky voice, and 18% of the syllables that the women spoke contained creaky voice, which really is not very big a difference, okay? So if the numbers aren't really all that different, then why does it go unnoticed in men? So why do people pick on it as a characteristic of women's speech and not really say very much about the fact that men do it too? Well, one possibility is that the low pitch of creaky voice isn't really very different from the typical pitch of a male speaker, right? So one thing I said is that one of the primary acoustic properties of creaky voice is that it has a pretty low pitch. So if a man starts out with a low pitch and his creaky voice is also pretty low pitched, listeners might not really notice that difference. Whereas in women tend to have a higher modal pitch and a lower creaky pitch, and you might notice that big difference between them. But there might also be a bias simply to notice that women are doing it. So even when men do it, people might not fixate on it as much as they do as when women do it. So in order to address this, I'm actually currently working on some research looking at this. And in one of the studies that I'm working on, I was interested in how often people notice creak in men and women. So I did a little training. I trained them to understand what creak is. And then I looked at the accuracy on noticing creak in both female speakers and male speakers. And the participants were also a group of both men and women. And when you include female speakers and male speakers who just have a variety of pitch ranges, so everybody has a variety of pitch ranges, and they're all presented in the same study, what you find is that female speakers, people notice creak when it is there in female speakers 83% of the time, and they notice creak when it's in male speakers 65% of the time. But when you hold the pitch range constant, so that is, you take men and women who have the same modal pitch and the same creaky pitch, so basically low-pitched women and men who have a slightly higher normal pitch, and you compare just those ones, so you're holding everything constant, what you see is that the same pattern holds, right? 87% of the people notice it when female speakers have creak, and 57% of the people notice, and people notice it 57% of the time in male speakers. So people are more likely to identify creaky voice in female speakers, right? That seems to be what we're showing here. But another question we can ask then is, are all types of listeners equally contemptuous of it? Because that seems to be what the press is leading us to believe. So one issue here is that, much like Laurel was kind of talking about with respect to the nature of the standard language, here too evaluation is in the eye of the beholder. So on the right, Slate worried about why old men find young women's voices so annoying. But a recent study showed that when younger speakers evaluate people who speak with creaky voice, what they find, or what they say, is that the speakers sound professional or upwardly mobile or urban, and these are not, these are positive characteristics. And also lots of research shows that young women are often at the forefront of language change. So the people who today, right, the older generation who thinks that this is an unacceptable voice quality, well, they're not going to be around forever, and the generations that are younger than them aren't going to be so bothered by this voice quality anymore. So where do we stand with all of this? Well, I think that research indicates that there is, in fact, bias against voice qualities that are associated with women. The media certainly tells us that, but research bears it out as well. But one point I do want to make is that voice qualities like creaky voice are not pathological, and they're not damaging our vocal health, and I think this is an important thing to convey. And also, along with this, people who then wish to sort of eradicate their damaging vocal tics, so sometimes people will seek professional help to rid themselves of creaky voice or uptalk. We should all recognize that people might want to do this, or the reason behind doing this is really for social or professional reasons, but not because of their health per se, so please don't let anybody tell you that. And lastly, negative perceptions of voices are hard to combat. That's why we're here, right? Okay, we're here to talk about the kinds of things that that sometimes fly under the radar when it comes to speech and linguistic properties. But I think the first step, much like Laurel also pointed out, is admitting that they are subjective. These negative perceptions are subjective and often born out of bias. Thank you.